What if the person who saved your life disappeared before you could thank them? In 1969, during a fierce battle near Quang Ngai, a young American soldier named David Larson was caught in a devastating ambush, the air filled with gunfire, explosions, and shouting. Within minutes, the jungle swallowed everything. When the noise finally stopped, David lay bleeding on the forest floor, alone and barely conscious. The rest of his unit had been forced to retreat, leaving him behind. He tried to crawl, but the pain was unbearable. His vision blurred as he pressed his hand to the wound on his side. Blood soaked through his uniform. The heat was suffocating, insects swarmed, and every breath came slower than the last. He knew he wouldn't survive another day on his own. Hours passed. The jungle was silent, except for the hum of cicadas and the distant echo of artillery. Then, somewhere between dream and delirium, he heard footsteps. Soft, careful. Not boots, bare feet. A woman appeared from behind the trees carrying a small woven basket filled with herbs and roots. She froze when she saw him, eyes wide with fear and confusion. But instead of turning away, she took a cautious step forward. Her name, he would later learn, was Lan. She knelt beside him, looked over his wounds, and pressed strips of fabric torn from her own clothing against the bleeding. She said something in Vietnamese, words he couldn't understand, but her tone carried urgency. When the sound of distant soldiers echoed through the forest, she didn't hesitate. She slipped her arms under him and, with all her strength, dragged his body into the dense shadows of the trees. That act, that single decision, would follow David Larson for the rest of his life. Lan hid David in a small bamboo hut deep within the jungle, far from the sound of gunfire and patrols. The shelter was barely large enough for one person, but she made space for him on a straw mat near the wall. Each morning, she brought boiled water and a few handfuls of rice. At night, she crushed herbs and pressed them gently against his wounds, whispering quiet prayers as she worked. Outside, the war moved like thunder. Helicopters overhead, distant explosions, voices shouting through the trees. Inside that tiny hut, there was only the sound of breathing and the soft crackle of a small fire. Neither of them spoke the same language, but they understood each other in ways that didn't need words. Lan was 26 years old, a widow whose husband had died earlier that year. She lived alone, surviving on what she could grow and trade in nearby villages. Helping an American soldier was dangerous. If anyone found out, she could be imprisoned or worse. But every day she chose compassion over fear. David tried to communicate, sketching small drawings in the dirt. A flag, a helicopter, the face of a woman with kind eyes. Lan smiled faintly, though her eyes revealed sadness. She didn't know what his future would be, only that he had to live. On the third night, when his fever finally broke, she led him through the forest under the cover of darkness. They stopped by a quiet riverbank, the moonlight glinting off the water. Lan placed a small bamboo raft beside him and pointed downstream. Then she pressed a compass into his hand. Her eyes filled with determination. Without words, she told him what he already knew. It was time to go, and she wanted him to survive. David drifted downstream for hours before soldiers finally spotted him. When they pulled him from the water, he was weak, barely able to speak, but alive. His unit had already written him off as missing in action. No one expected him to return. When they asked how he'd made it back, he simply said someone had helped him. He never mentioned Lan's name, not because he wanted to forget, but because he wanted to protect her. After the war, David returned home to Minnesota. Like many veterans, he tried to rebuild a normal life. He married, started a family, and found work repairing machinery. On the outside, things looked steady, but the memories never truly left him. Every night, when the house was quiet, he would find himself thinking of the jungle, the smell of rain on the leaves, the hum of insects, the face of the woman who had appeared like a miracle in his darkest hour. He often wondered what had become of her, whether she had survived, whether she still remembered the soldier she once saved. Years turned into decades. His hair turned gray. His children grew up, and the war became something people spoke of less and less. But for David, it was never history. It was personal. He kept a small notebook filled with sketches and brief notes, fragments of memory he didn't want to lose. Sometimes he would take it out and stare at one simple drawing: a river, a bamboo hut, and a woman standing at the edge of the trees. When he turned 70, his daughter gave him a gift that changed everything. Inside a small envelope was a plane ticket to Vietnam. Beneath it, a note. It said only 3 words: "Go find her." 50 years after the war, David Larson stepped off a plane in Da Nang. The moment he felt the warm air hit his face, memories came flooding back. The country had changed beyond recognition: highways, tall buildings, hotels, and lights stretching along the coast. Yet beneath the noise and color, he could still feel the heartbeat of the Vietnam he once knew. He carried a small backpack with 2 things that mattered most: a faded photograph of himself in uniform and a sketch he had drawn decades ago, his memory of Lan's face. The lines were rough, but her eyes were clear. He had drawn them hundreds of times, afraid that one day he might forget. With the help of a translator named Min, he began searching. They traveled from town to town, showing the drawing to villagers, visiting old markets, and talking to elders who still remembered the war. Most shook their heads. Some looked at the picture in silence before saying they didn't know. Each day that passed chipped away at his hope, but he refused to stop. Weeks later, while visiting a crowded marketplace, something changed. An elderly man behind a fruit stall studied the sketch for a long moment. He said he recognized her. The woman in the drawing had once lived near a river, not far from the site of an old battlefield. Min translated every word carefully. The man pointed down the road, explaining that she was still alive. David's heart began to race. After half a century, after endless nights wondering if she had survived, he finally had a direction, a name spoken aloud again after 50 silent years. He thanked the man, clutched the drawing in his hands, and set out toward the river. The road wound through quiet villages and green rice fields before ending beside a slow, muddy river. A small wooden house stood there, surrounded by banana trees and wildflowers. On the porch sat an elderly woman, her silver hair tied back, her face lined with years of work and sun. David stopped at the gate and stared. Even after all this time, he knew the eyes were the same, calm, kind, steady. It was Lan. For a moment he couldn't move. 50 years of memories collided at once: the gunfire, the pain, the darkness, and then her face leaning over him in the jungle. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. The translator followed quietly behind. Lan looked up as the footsteps approached. At first she seemed unsure. Then recognition flickered across her expression like light breaking through clouds. She stood slowly, her hands trembling. David removed his hat and bowed his head slightly. They didn't speak right away. There were no words for what stood between them. The translator explained who he was, what had happened, and why he had come. Lan listened, her eyes shining. When the translation ended, she reached out, touching his arm gently. It was the same gesture she had made all those years ago in the jungle, the simple human act of reassurance. They sat on the porch together for hours. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. The river moved quietly behind them, the same river that had once carried him away to safety. Lan's daughter brought tea and fruit, and the small group shared a calm silence that needed no translation. As the sun began to set, David reached into his bag and handed Lan a small silver bracelet. She turned it over in her hands, smiled softly, and nodded once. No words were needed. Both of them understood. When David returned home to the United States, something inside him had changed. For the first time in 50 years, he felt a quiet peace. The search that had driven him for half a lifetime was finally over. He had found the woman who saved him, and with that, the burden he had carried since 1969 began to fade. Back in Minnesota, his days were simple. Mornings spent in the garden, afternoons by the lake, evenings on the porch as the sun dipped below the trees. Yet every small moment felt different now. He would often think about Lan and the world she lived in, how her days probably began with the sound of roosters and ended with the hum of crickets. They were thousands of miles apart, but the bond between them felt unbroken. They stayed in touch through her daughter, exchanging letters and photographs. Lan's family would send pictures of the riverbank, of grandchildren running through the yard, of new flowers growing beside the old bamboo hut. David would send back postcards of snow-covered fields, of his family gathered for dinner, of the quiet life he had built. Every message was short but meaningful. Years passed that way. Their letters slowed but never stopped. Sometimes a single photograph would arrive with only a few words written on the back. Still here, still remembering. On his desk, David kept one picture in a small wooden frame. It showed him and Lan sitting side by side on her porch, the river glimmering in the background. He would look at it before bed, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. Lan had saved his life once in the jungle, but meeting her again had saved him a second time. It reminded him that the war didn't define everything. What survived was the humanity within it, the kindness that outlasted the hatred, the compassion that refused to fade. A soldier and a woman connected by one act of courage that bridged half a century. And even now, when the jungle is quiet and the river keeps flowing, their story still lives on.